And we defined this as a public demonstration of support for or opposition to one side of a partisan socio-political issue. And what we said was that this construct, we said, is unique, and that it's differentiated from two traditional non-market activities that firms have been engaging in for a really long time. So I think most of us in this room are really familiar with corporate social responsibility, which is when brands do things like donate to different philanthropic causes, when they promote sustainability, when they do things like wanting to save the rainforest. We're very familiar with these types of activities. On the other hand, firms have also for decades engaged in corporate political activity, and this is more discreet, but it's things like lobbying, donating to different political candidates in the interest of influencing policy and changing regulations and helping the firm in that way. And there's been a lot of literature on both of those topics, and we know that both CSR and corporate political activities, for the most part, have positive financial implications. Corporate sociopolitical activism, though, we find to be a very distinct construct on basically two different dimensions. One, which is how public the action is, and the other is on partisanship. And CSR, for the most part, is usually pretty highly publicized because firms like to create that goodwill with their stakeholders, but it's also very low on partisanship. It's usually not anything controversial. Corporate political activity, on the other hand, high in partisanship. It's a question of who firms are donating to in terms of political parties and things like that, but it's typically very low in terms of publicity. Firms don't like the public to know some of these kind of hidden agenda activities that they engage in. Corporate sociopolitical activism, on the other hand, is high in terms of both highly partisan, highly public, which creates the situation where you have both very polarized responses. You have people that really, really support these behaviors, and then you have people that are very angered by them. And so given that you have these polarized responses and that CSA seems to be very distinct from these two other firm activities, we felt like it was really important to examine the financial consequences of this behavior. And the first question that we asked is, well, how do investors react to companies that do this? And our first hypothesis was essentially that we felt that investors probably see this as a fundamentally risky behavior that has the potential to alienate large groups of the market. By alienating different stakeholders, it's likely to jeopardize future cash flow. And then finally, that this is a risky behavior that might divert the firm's attention and resources away from more traditional value maximizing strategies like new product development or other brand building tactics. So Nooshin will get into how we actually tested this hypothesis, but I'm going to go ahead and kind of cut to the end and just give it away, which is that investors actually, on average, when we looked at this, we found that they react negatively on average to sociopolitical activism. And in fact, we found that looking at our sample, we found that on average, you see a negative 0.4% decline in firm value when firms engage in activism, which may seem like a small amount, but when you look at a company like General Electric, valued at $600 billion, that's a decrease of over $2 billion in their firm value. Interestingly, though, we felt like this may be how investors react on the average, but given that this is a somewhat consumer-driven firm behavior, it would make sense that there might be instances where investors actually may react positively. And so we looked at some of the different examples of CSA in our sample, and we saw that there were instances when investors actually reacted positively. So for example, after the church shooting that was racially motivated in Charleston, Amazon removed Confederate flag merchandise from its website, and investors actually reacted quite positively to that. So that led us to the question that, are there other mitigating factors that actually influence how negatively or positively investors may respond when firms engage in activism? And we identified essentially two different buckets of factors that influence how investors respond. And the first is simply, investors are looking to anticipate what are the likely outcomes of CSA. And we really looked at, and one of those things was essentially how investors anticipate different stakeholders will respond to CSA. And then the other bucket of factors that we looked at was that investors are looking for cues to kind of uncover unobservable attributes of the firm. And in this case, that's what are the firm's values and what are the firm's strategic priorities. And so we identified different cues that kind of help investors make judgments of these things that aren't necessarily obvious to the public. So I'll jump in and talk a little bit about the first bucket. So looking at the outcomes of CSA. So what we've found was that CSA can either really strengthen relationships with stakeholders, or on the other hand, it can jeopardize those relationships. And so we identified three different stakeholders: customers, employees, and state government employees that all have different values. And the more the CSA deviates from their core values, the more likely investors are going to be very nervous about that particular CSA event. And then we also look to see how much a company's engagement in CSA really affected or how much it deviated from its brand image. So there might be some brands that you expect them to do CSA, whereas there's others that it seems to not be a very good fit with their brand image. So looking at the stakeholders, for example, we looked at customers, and you think about Target. When they introduced an inclusive gender restroom policy, there were boycotts all over social media. People, took to signs and pickets outside of Target stores. And so we would assume that the more the customer's personal values deviated from this policy, the more negative impact the firm would feel in terms of cash flows, because customers obviously affect cash flows through their purchase behaviors. The second group of stakeholders that we looked at were employees. Wayfair, for example, their employees were very upset when they found out that Wayfair was supplying furniture to refugee detainment centers at the southern border, and they actually staged a walkout. Another example of sort of a misalignment between employee values and the firm would be with the NFL or NBA, where you had a lot of players that really wanted the company to stand up and talk about Black Lives Matters. So the more the CSA event aligns with employees' values, you would expect that investors would be less wary of such actions. And then the final stakeholder would be the state government. And the alignment between the CSA activism and the government's values would again affect investor responses. So the example we have here is that when Delta canceled the discount to the NRA after the Parkland school shooting, the Georgia state government actually rescinded a huge tax break to Delta. And so investors look to that and they say, wow, if the government really doesn't like a company's activism, they can punish the firm for engaging in activism, and that could really affect, again, their cash flows and profitability. So we looked at these different stakeholders. That was the bucket that would affect the outcome of CSA. And then we looked at some different attributes that might be good cues at understanding what the firm's strategic priorities are. And the first one that we looked at was the form of support. So was the CSA event a statement or an action? So you have companies like Ben & Jerry's or Doritos that actually created products that supported either LGBT rights or that protested the Trump administration. PayPal actually said that they would not have they would not employ anyone in the state of North Carolina because of restrictive or laws that PayPal felt were discriminatory against LGBT employees. Those are all actions. And on the other hand, you had firms that signed letters. So Apple's Tim Cook, he spoke out against discrimination laws, or he signed letters. And our logic here was essentially that actions speak louder than words, and the actions signal a deeper commitment to CSA, which is inherently somewhat risky. And so you would expect that investors would be more concerned over CSA that comes in the form of an action as opposed to a simple statement of support. The second factor that we looked at was whether or not the activism, who announced the activism? Was it the CEO or was it just somebody within the firm? So Starbucks CEO Howard Schultz, he came out with multiple different statements, and he announced them himself. And again, we argue that this signals a deeper commitment to CSA, which investors feel is inherently risky. The third kind of factor that we looked at was whether or not the firm communicated that their engagement in CSA was motivated by a business interest, right? So some companies, they stand up and they say, hey, we're not doing this to make money. We're doing this because it's the right thing to do, like Ben & Jerry's. I mean, we hypothesize that this type of activism is particularly threatening to investors because it signals that the firm is doing this regardless of creating profits and maximizing profits, versus companies that come out and say, hey, we're doing this because it makes business sense. It makes sense to protect our employees, or it makes sense to be more inclusive, things of that nature. And then the final factor that we looked at is whether or not activism was conducted with other firms within a coalition, or whether activism was conducted completely alone. And our argument here was essentially that when activism is done with a large group of firms, it kind of dissipates some of that negative backlash amongst all of the companies that did it together versus just one that does it alone. So with that, that was I think the conceptual model for this paper. And I'd like to hand it over to Nooshin, who can talk about how we actually did this and the imperative analysis.
Thank you so much, Yash. I'm going to, if that's okay, from my end so that I can have control over the slide as well. So far we talked about basically our framework and our theoretical arguments. So I'm just going to wrap it up here and explain that so far what conceptually we tried to show was, first of all, how CSA can be distinctly defined, and also how, using the screening, and we looked at how investors would use unobservable attributes, unobservable cues, and the likely outcomes to decide how this event or this activism is going to affect firms' financial status in the future and their future cash flow. Now, to test all of these, we had to start from what we want to measure, right? So we are talking about investors' reaction. What do we talk about when we say investors' reaction? And this is where we use event study. Just a quick explanation of it would be that when one of those events, as Yash was explaining, the Amazon taking merchandise with Confederate flags out of happens, investors will predict the future outcome of this event, and we will see their reaction basically affects into how buy or sell the stock, and therefore the price of the stock will be adjusted. So if without this event, that blue line was what was expected, what actually realized would be the orange line, and what we look at is the difference between these two, which is basically what was the normal reaction or normal return to this event. So that would be the dependent variable that we want to look at. And then we need to see, okay, so one part would be that, okay, what is this abnormal return? Is it going to be positive or negative? But also how this is going to be modified, which was the model that we showed you in our conceptual framework. To get those variables, we had to know several issues. One is that the events, each one of those events, do they have a politically liberal or conservative stance? If we announce that we take the Confederate flags out of the merchandise, or allow them to be on the merchandise, that would be more of a liberal stance. Whereas when Chick-fil-A announced that they stand by their values in the Bible about the marriage equality, then that would have a conservative flavor or a stance. So we needed to know what the stance of the event was, the activism was. We also needed to know what the stance of consumers are. What are the political ideology of those consumers? For these parts, we did surveys. We did large surveys to ask individuals from mechanical and Turk to answer what they think that this event is, liberal or conservative. We use the 0 scale bar so that we can see how much they think, what is the intensity of this stance as well. We did the same about the customers. For knowing what the employees of a firm stand for or what is their political values, we looked at Federal Election Commission, which will give us the information about the donations of individuals to different campaigns, political campaigns, whether conservative or liberal. We then looked at who these people work for, and based on that, we could know the employees of a company. Well, what is the aggregate or average political stance of these people? And finally, the government's stance for each that the firms for that, we looked at legislature, whatever was at the legislature at the time. So when we get these data, then we can calculate how much this event is deviating from the stance of our customers, employees, or government. Mathematically calculated it. So if we see that the event stance and customer stance is very similar, then it's not deviated from customers' political stance. And if it's going more towards 2, considering that our scale is from -1 to 1, then it would be extremely deviated. And finally, for brand deviation, we also ran a survey data and asked people how much they think that the image of this brand, image of this brand stands for, matches what this activism sense is, and how this matches. A very quick glance of what could be found in terms of numbers. You could events so that very and the same deviation can be very low, and yes, the Australia had variance as well. So this would be a quick glance of how we collected our data. Eventually, so the announcement data came, and as I explained, all the stances were calculated. We got that's financial data for each firm, and we controlled for event-specific variables such as how controversial it was, the category of the event, was it for LGBT equality, racial equality, and so on. And then we collected the long list of firm-specific variables, starting from their CSR and CPA stance to their CEO's characteristics, to the firm's characteristics, and their own structure, and finally the industry and time-specific variables were collected. If we look at the descriptive statistics of this data set, we see that, well, first and foremost, the cars or the investors' reaction were negative and significant for all three types calculation of the estimated stock price. And then we also saw some interesting information in there. For example, 40% of the events at the time that we collected them were actions, 30% of them were announced by the CEO, 50% of the events showed some sort of business communication with their investors, and coalition sizes could go from 0, meaning that the firms stand alone, to 200 firms together. Then we ran a cross-sectional model. So we basically ran a panel model. We had a selection correction, and I'm not going to go over it, but if anyone has questions about it, I'll be happy to get into that later. The results that we saw was that, in fact, the deviation doesn't matter. The more deviated the event was from the stakeholders' views, the worse the reaction of the investors was. We did not see that as a statistically significant effect for brand deviation, but for the rest of them, we did observe that. And then in terms of implications of how now and for showing investors or cueing that a firm is putting efforts, resources, or time into these types of events, investors would have a more negative reaction to share the blame or share the resources in the large coalition size, or do persuade investors in terms of business consequences of that can help us having more confidence into this. Now, this is interesting. The more we are deviated, the more we can see negative effects. And it would have been easy if do two firms, you could say that, okay, do something that your stakeholders are not like. The problem is that a lot of times this is not as easy. There are very few firms that, if you look at the political ideology of their stakeholders, like JCPenney, that okay, customers, employees, and government are all conservative or all liberal. That would be more straightforward. But the problem is that there are many firms that this is not the case. For example, if you look at Whole Foods, the customers and employees are largely liberal, but Whole Foods' headquarters is in Texas, significantly conservative state. So there is going to be some mismatches between the stakeholders' values. And then the question would be, okay, how should firms predict or push investors? To know that, we looked at all these different types of overlapping of deviations between events and the stakeholders, put together 8 groups from our events. The first group would be more straightforward, which is when everyone is on board, we see that investors react positively. We also looked at sales. Sales growth before and after the event to see how consumers react, and we see that that is also positive. On the other end, of course, when everyone is not on board, we see negative results. The middle ground, what we see is that if you have 2 of your stakeholders on board, if one of them is consumers, you still will have a basically a consequence that is by and large positive. And on the other hand, if you have 2 of stakeholders not on board, it's not going to work, especially if one of them is consumers. So the bottom line, what we could say to the managers is know your audience, especially your consumers, because they matter a lot. Even if you look at it in just on average results, we see that when consumers are on board, we see, and when they're not, we see the average sale decreasing. It is interesting to point out, though, that the increase in sale when consumers are decrease, which is kind of what we've been saying, that boycotts are hot and very has a lot of buzz, but it will die down when consumers, it seems that when consumers see that the firm is standing up for their values, they're happy to spend their money and overcompensate for such firms. This has been the results that we've seen in this paper so far, and based on that, what we could tell managers is this is just the part from our paper. I cannot wait to hear more from Whitney about this, but we manager with some that when deciding to get involved in CSA, it is important that we know the stakeholders, especially customers, but there are times that firms want to stand for something, even if that is not what is aligned with their stakeholders. In those cases, they should prepare for the financial consequences and try to persuade their investors, explain the business consequences, explain what can be the reason aside from the greater good to their investors. What we have tried to do in this paper was to, first of all, explain that CSA at this point in time is something that is distinct from other non-market actions and show some initial financial consequences. Now, there are so many questions left, and there are so many avenues that needs to be researched or discussed with the practice. And that is one reason that we're all here with our guest speaker from Porter Novelli to learn more about this. So I'm going to stop here and thank you all for listening. Give the floor to our other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Nooshin. That research is just so fascinating. I just really enjoyed hearing you present it and learn more about it. Thank you so much. And I think what I'll share now is complementary in a lot of ways to what you have shared. So I will just pull up my screen now, make sure everybody can see that. And just put this into, okay, can everyone see the presentation? If someone could just come off mute and just make sure you can see it.
Yes.
You're good.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much. Great. So I am here today to share a bit of research that we conducted earlier this year on that intersection of business responsibility and social justice. As Nooshin was saying, you need to know your consumer, you need to know your customer. So that is really what we unpacked in this, is the various pressures that companies are facing in addition to firm value, the different stakeholders companies must consider when deciding the age-old question, if, when, and how to speak up or address certain issues in society. So for the purposes of this research, I will use the term social justice, but it does pair well with the term corporate socio-political activism outlined in Yashoda and Nooshin's research as well. So just as a little context, last year in 2020, we conducted a series of tracker research studies in rapid succession every 2 weeks to really understand American expectations of companies engaging in a number of major events in 2020, including the racial and social justice conversation unfolding. So at that time, we found that 80% of Americans, so 8 in 10 Americans, expected companies to recognize their role in systemic racial inequality, and that half of employees were reconsidering their current job because they felt their company wasn't doing enough around social justice issues. And finally, 3/4 of Americans were worried that companies would move on to the next issue without making the promises they made around addressing racial inequalities. And so to understand how that conversation had evolved over the past 12 months, we conducted this new research in May. So what has changed? Have companies made the progress that they promised in those statements, those actions that they committed to? And where do we need to go from here? So this study was fielded online between April 16th and 18th, 2021. We had a total sample of 1,000 US general market adults ages 18 and older, and we had the data weighted against US Census population estimates. So a quick overview of some of the topics that we covered in the report that we'll walk through today. And then I've peppered in addition to the consumer perspective, some data on employees, executives, and even some investment community perspectives that we've seen kind of unfold over the past year. So although, we know the fight for social justice has been a slow march over years and decades, 2020 was really just punctuated in the minds of Americans. And the consumer, the customer company relationship has really been forever transformed. So this report confirms what we have been seeing in previous Porter Novelli research studies and showing that consumers and Americans are really telling us that companies can just no longer sit on the sidelines while the world is reeling. So as we dive into the data, what we're seeing here is that Americans believe that this time has really forced organizations to confront their own roles in perpetuating systems of inequality and oppression in the United States. In fact, 64% of individuals think the past year has made companies recognize and understand their role in kind of addressing systemic racism. And yet for Americans, there's this sense that it shouldn't have taken this long, or perhaps so many incidents of pain and anger or violence, for companies to see that they could be instrumental in disrupting the status quo. Nearly 7 in 10 individuals say, again, it shouldn't take a tragedy like the murder of George Floyd or the salon killings in Atlanta, Georgia, for companies to care. Nearly the same amount still question whether companies are in this reactive phase when it comes to speaking up, with 67% of individuals stating they think companies wait until a social justice issue is headline news before they're willing to talk about it. And as we move beyond the year marker, when many companies promised massive change, Americans are also keeping a keen eye on that progress that was promised. We have more than half of Americans say they're watching to see how brands have made progress in addressing social justice issues. 45% say they have gone so far as to do their own research to see that progress towards those commitments. But this level of accountability is actually coming from the belief that companies can be instrumental in creating change. We have 60% of Americans stating that they're optimistic that as companies begin to address social justice issues, we will see real change. Americans today maintain this mandate that companies not only participate in this process, but also be a driving force. So what is that business case? What would reduce that level of risk that was referenced by Yash and Yashoda around that business case? So we'll unpack that a little bit in terms of the consumer perspective now. So what we're seeing is more than 2/3 of Americans believe companies have a role to play in addressing social justice issues, and 6 in 10 actually say they expect companies to take the lead. And of course, beyond a moral imperative, Americans actually believe that there is a built-in business case for companies to get involved. 66% believe it's good for business when companies address social justice issues. And perhaps that's because individuals are prepared to put their power behind brands that align with them on important issues. We have 6 in 10 saying that they will reward companies that they see actively addressing social justice issues. And how exactly are they rewarding? We have 67% say they support that company by purchasing the products. The same amount say they were more likely to trust, those reputational benefit. But we're seeing other benefits come through from consumers and other stakeholders. We have increased loyalty, a likelihood to recommend, willingness to defend that big brand, and even a propensity to feel a deeper emotional connection with that company. And this propensity to reward flows into the job market. We'll reference this a little bit later in the research, but what we're seeing is 6 in 10 Americans said that they would want to work for companies that are actively and authentically addressing these issues. And again, we've gone through some of the benefits from a consumer perspective that's coming through with the research. But if companies need added incentive, know this. Nearly half of Americans also said that they would punish a company that's not actively addressing issues by boycotting or speaking out against them. So although many in the past, yes, reducing risk was the #1 thing that a company wanted to do. They would avoid divisive conversations to protect their reputation, or perhaps for fear of saying or doing something, the wrong thing. What we're seeing through this research is that Americans are sending a different message. Today, silence can be at the minimum construed as indifference, but at its worst, complicity. The research found 6 in 10 individuals say it's no longer acceptable for companies to stay silent on social justice issues, and a further 49 say they assume companies that remain silent just don't care. So again, this push that we're seeing though through the research to get companies involved in speaking up is really coming from the belief that corporate marketing and communications can be influential on these topics. Americans believe companies have this powerful platform to drive conversations, change minds, and even action. 62% of Americans saying companies can actually help normalize social justice conversations through their marketing and communications. And a further 60% say when companies talk about social justice issues, it can actually help prevent further violence and prejudices. And while companies that are invited to kind of authentically engage in this conversation, it comes with a level of accountability. We saw that scale earlier in terms of the statement, the action, the product. This is what Americans are looking for. 6 in 10 say when a company makes a statement of support, they will hold that company accountable. But even here, Americans are understanding this is a journey. 66% say no, they understand true change isn't going to happen immediately, but they do expect to see progress from companies. And as we look at the employee audience specifically, a very important stakeholder, as was again referenced earlier, we're seeing that Americans are keeping a keen eye on if and how their employer is joining this movement. In fact, more than half of employees that we surveyed said they hold their employer to a higher standard than other companies when it comes to addressing social justice issues. And perhaps that's because employees are feeling the impact of these issues on a very personal level. 57% want their companies to address these issues that impact them personally. And finally, for some employees, a company's participation or lack thereof in tackling social justice issues can actually be a deal breaker. We see 43% of employees today say that they're reconsidering their current job because they feel their company hasn't done enough around these topics externally. And executives are certainly feeling this pressure. The mandate from consumers, but also employees, other stakeholders getting involved in this conversation. So from our 2020 executive purpose study, what we found is that nearly 3/4 of executives today actually feel more empowered than ever to use their role to address pressing issues in the world today, as we see that transition from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. A further 7 in 10 said in their entire careers, they've never felt more pressure as a business leader to respond to these issues. And finally, we're also seeing an element of peer pressure come out and in play amongst executives. 74% say they believe they have a responsibility to actually hold their peers accountable as well. And finally, over the past year, we're starting to see traction unfold within the investor community as well. So what we see, and these are just ripped from the headlines, that the world of ESG investment is only increasing. Even after the worst market correction in the past decade, we're seeing record inflows, upwards of 20 billion in the first half of 2020 into ESG funds. So this is really something that's increasing over time. And in fact, in terms of the performance of these funds and indices, Morgan Stanley's Sustainable Reality survey actually found that the returns of sustainable funds were in line with or comparable to traditional funds in looking at performance of nearly 11,000 mutual funds between 2004 and 2018. And in fact, the report concluded that there is no statistically significant difference in total returns, but that the sustainable funds actually offered lower market risk, according again to this Morgan Stanley study, and that these funds experience a 20% smaller downside deviation from traditional funds. So we're starting to see evidence, even from the investor community, that addressing or investing in sustainable funds, addressing social justice can actually be good from an investment perspective. So more to come on that, but some interesting indications in headlines over the past year. So as I wrap up this portion of the presentation, really looking forward to the conversation, I'll just close with a few key takeaways that we covered in this research. And again, in the eyes of Americans, there is an expectation for companies to act and sometimes even lead when it comes to addressing social justice issues. And that's because Americans are really recognizing that power of marketing and communication to change behavior, ideas, and as we saw, even prevent future violence or prejudices. In the employee stakeholder community, holding companies to a higher standard, showing that this can actually impact recruitment as well as retention. I'm happy to talk to you more about how this impacts the upcoming Gen Z population in particular, but that's going to be something that everyone should be watching in terms of employee satisfaction and how companies are leaning into addressing social justice issues. And then we see executives feeling this pressure from various stakeholders like never before, but also from their own peers. And that is spurring them to action as well. And finally, investors kind of seeing the value in addressing social justice issues. Yes, of course, there's risk involved in kind of being out there and putting a stake in the ground, but investors are starting to see that maybe that's not such a bad thing in terms of long-term value and profitability. So that takes me through the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can dive into a conversation. I'll turn it back over to Paige. Thank you.
Thank you, Whitney, and thank you, Yash and Nooshin. This is a great example of how academics and practitioners can come at an absolutely important issue and a timely one. It's interesting because I think that Nooshin and Yash's data was collected. I think the data collection ended around 2016, and Whitney, your statistics are very current, and it would be very interesting to hear from Yash and Nooshin, what your thoughts are if you could access the data right now.
Yash?
Yeah, no, I think it would be so fascinating to see how investors would respond to activism today, because it's become so even more prevalent. And so is that shock factor still there? And especially with statistics like what Whitney was telling us, as they've become more public, it seems like maybe investors now see activism is actually forward looking, right? Like if you're doing this to create a better relationship with Gen Z, then is it actually not necessarily as risky? I think it would be fascinating to see.
I think as a personal opinion, I would love to study this, but as a personal opinion, I think that what we're seeing, at least so far, kind of maps on how CSR evolved. So when firms started doing corporate social responsibility, the same reaction was happening from their shareholders that this is unnecessary, you're supposed to do profit-making actions. And then it went to the point that it was necessary for the business, and then it became even profit-making at some point. So I think that as the time goes by, and as you pointed out, Paige, we see that the difference between when we were collecting the data. And now one big reason is that one big difference is that now not saying anything by itself is risky, where maybe 5 or 6 years ago it wasn't. So the meaning of risk is changing. Is it risky to say something and upset some people, or is it risky not to say something and upset a large group of people? These are all fascinating, and I think that they're great places to do research on.
And I want to follow that up. I want to take Whitney up on her offer of talking about the Gen Zs, and particularly for all of you, the thing I really like is that you talk about the pressure coming not only from consumers but also from employees. Which source of push do you think is going to have the most impact on getting corporations to take these stands?
I'm happy to jump in maybe and kick it off. I mean, in terms of looking at the different stakeholders, I think what's really interesting is when we saw, corporate socio-political activism kind of come on the scene, it was a lot of consumer-facing companies, CPG companies. And that was because they were maybe one of the first indicators we were seeing was from the consumer stakeholder. But now B2B companies have as much skin in the game as every other organization because of the employee stakeholder. What the research is showing us, the Porter Novelli research, is that employees are holding their own companies, their own employers at a higher standard than other companies in the marketplace. And that they want to see their company take more of a leadership position. Pairing that with the incredible employee migration that is currently happening across the US and the globe, where we're seeing people leave their jobs in record numbers and kind of consider other options for employment. So I think that the companies are really feeling that pressure to better understand their employees, better understand what's important to them, and respond to that to really increase that retention that is a real business issue right now. Yash and Nooshin, I don't know if you have any other perspectives.
No, I totally agree with you. And I also think that definitely there is a generational change in terms of attitude towards standing up for a cause. Not only that, but also we see a lot of this even political differences stemming from the generational divide. So as we have our boomers and we have our Generation X that are more on the side of generally this is not the job of a firm to speak up, also we have more of the conservative values on that side. So both of them together, on the other side, as we come to Generation Z, becomes more outspoken. The companies are seen more as individuals, as a person itself, and it has to have an opinion and value to stand up for. More importantly, there are more people who are willing in these generations to actually stand up for these issues. So it does make sense that as we move forward with these generations, we see more that they see this as a duty of a firm, not just an unexpected action happening.
Great. So I want to follow this up. We have a question from Ashley, who is curious about how long a company should keep these messages going. If the company stops too soon, would the negative feelings from consumers happen? If they do it too long, would the customers think that the company is not sincere about taking advantage of the situation? Whitney, I think this one may be for you.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting thing to examine. And actually, we have an internal process that we use with our clients to help them determine, should you be standing up for XYZ issue? If so, how should you take a leadership perspective? Should it just be among employees? And one of the things that we look at is, how long can you sustain your commitment to this issue? because I do think that that is critical in terms of creating authenticity. Our research is showing that a year plus after a company makes a statement, consumers are going back and doing research to see, okay, this company made this commitment. What's the progress? Have they delivered on it? So they are starting to look under the hood and do research. So I do think it's important to kind of sustain that. In terms of if they do it too long, is it insincere? I think a company needs to balance, how much of this is reporting against the progress that they've made and reinforcing their commitments, and how often do they share those messages so that it doesn't become kind of overload in the marketplace, like they're leaning too much on that, and trying to get credit for that work that might not seem as authentic.
So that makes a lot of sense. I think the authenticity construct is getting a whole lot of attention in academic circles and certainly in practitioner circles as well. And it's a tough thing to nail. Let's see, are there any other questions from the audience? Because I have some more.
Would it be okay if I just add something to this? Because I found that fascinating, but because while doing this studies and this research on this area, we constantly are also looking for new ways to collect data. And one thing that we noticed is that there's a large increase in the number of third-party firms that have started becoming that kind of the monitoring agency of firms, whether the firm 2 years ago they donated to Planned Parenthood, today are they standing up for this anti-abortion laws? I mean, are they protesting this anti-abortion laws or not? A firm that now says Black Lives Matter 5 years ago wouldn't even hire other color people except white groups. And all of that has become more and more firms, nonprofit firms or even for-profit firms, have started doing this as a kind of a consult on the side to the consumers. And to me, that shows that they see, as marketing researchers, we know that, right? There is a market for that. So they have started doing that, meaning that consumers are actually looking for that information, that if this firm is now standing up for something and it makes me happy, are they really authentic about it or not? And there's a third-party firm that is trying to provide me with that kind of a product, which also shows us that more and more there's a market, there's a demand for that sort of information by consumers.
Thanks for jumping in. I mean, it's fascinating to see corporate come in as the watchdogs. We aren't always used to that. But if there's an opportunity, that's fantastic, fantastic news. I had a question for you guys. These issues are by definition polarizing, and whether it's 60-40 or 55-45, what advice do you give to the companies that do take a stand in the way that they communicate to their employees or consumers who don't share their view on that issue?
I think it would be great for you to tell us what would you say.
I mean, I think it was revealed in your research, really, and it's knowing who you are as an organization and what your values are, and making sure that the world is clear on what your values are. Because I think if you enter this situation with those communications kind of already out there, it allows you to lean in on those when you have to make a tough call on whether you should support an issue or not. If your organization has strong values, a strong North Star, it should be clear, is this an issue we should address or not? And then when it comes to communicating to stakeholders that might not agree, you can say, look, this is something that we've talked about before. It's on our website. It shouldn't be a shock that this is something that we're leaning into because this is our organization, this is our values. So I think that can be helpful in those situations, because of course when we're talking about corporate socio-political activism, there is going to be a portion of the population that is going to be angered by what you do. It's very hard to navigate it and make sure all parties are happy. So again, leaning into your values, but then also explaining why it was important to take this step. Is it in alignment with the business and therefore it makes good business sense? Or maybe it's an issue that's extremely important to your employees, and that's why you must address it. I mean, again, I think that your paper really references that, is, you know, drawing the connection in a way that makes it relevant. One anecdote I will just share, which I thought was really interesting for companies that, you know, might be hesitant to lean in on this. Chris Miller, who you referenced in one of your quotes, who leads activism at Ben & Jerry's, their global activism manager, once shared with on the stage at South by Southwest in a session that we were doing, that among those consumers that know Ben & Jerry's purpose and values, they are 4 times more loyal to the brand. So yes, you might lose some, you know, fair weather fans if you make a statement, but if you have those strong, loyal consumers, then maybe that's okay. So again, we can't all be the Ben & Jerry's of the world, and certainly every brand has issues to navigate. But I just thought that was an interesting anecdote to share.
Also, there is there's so many fascinating intertwined situations, cultural situations and business situations at this point. I recently got an email from one of the journalists that was sharing with me an incident that's happening in one of our conservative states. I don't know if I have permission to name names, so I'm just going to give you this example because it was very interesting to me. There are this group of medical equipment companies, and they have a stand. They protested the omission of critical race theories from books, which in their eyes of their investors was totally out of the scope of their business, completely unrelated and completely unnecessary. And they wrote this very interesting letter to their investors, which explained that we are working in an area that needs scientists and needs people with knowledge and value. The problem is that if elementary schools have these things changed in their books, the parents of those children will leave our state, who are the people that we need to work for us here. So there is so much connections on the infrastructure of a society that you cannot think at this point that an issue can be out of the scope of a firm to look at, or this is what we are going to draw the line here and we're standing here and the rest of the stuff is not our issue. Somehow it will show up in the business. And this letter was interesting to me because very clearly it was explaining to the investors how this will affect the business, and therefore this is not just an issue that we're trying to be on a bandwagon of wokeness, basically. That was very interesting to me.
Right. I would love to have you guys on here all day. I think these are really, it's a dynamic conversation that just gets more dynamic, I think, as more people join it. I mean, my key takeaway that leaves me hopeful is that it sounds like it's becoming that not taking a stand is now taking a stand, and the backlash may be more powerful for not doing something. I want to thank all of the panelists and congratulate the winners again on the Root and MSI Root Award. Thank you for being here to present your really interesting research. And Whitney, thank you for joining to give us the reality check and the up-to-date statistics so we know what is going on currently in the marketplace. So a virtual hand clap for all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we also want to thank our 2 other co-authors who are also in this session, Josh Beck and George Watson. This paper couldn't happen with if our team was not together doing that. And thank you.
Great. Have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paige.
Bye-bye.